First of all, thank you, Sarah, for putting up with a difficult presenter, because I said I'd much rather come in and try and do it as much as the old-fashioned way as possible. However, Linda is staring at me through the window, or she was earlier, and making faces. So and now she's dancing over there. So you guys are really missing out on a treat. And I do have an audience of two besides Linda, Sarah, and my mom's actually here. So even though we're not doing this as a typical kind of public presentation, my mom's here to keep me honest. So I was contacted about doing this presentation. It was probably at least 1.5 years ago, if I'm right, Sarah. And they were pushing me for what titles I would come up with. And I have to be honest, when I came up with this one at the time, I wasn't really sure which direction it would go. However, as they were promoting this, it prompted me to go back and take a look at some of my notes. So what I want to talk about is the more things change, the more they stay the same, but really how our connections to buildings and sites kind of remain consistent or constant despite change. And so that's what we're going to walk through. And it's more of a reaction or emotion that we might have with buildings. So it's not going to be your typical kind of architecture or history tour. Okay, so nope. There's a notable contemporary architect who said, buildings creates your world and influences how you feel both mentally and spiritually. It's not a question of whether a building makes you feel good or bad. It's about being moved. And so what he said is, Leapskin said, that's what the word emotion means, actually being moved. And how do buildings move us? And I think the same can be said of locations that are kind of set deep into our mind, into our psyche. So I'm going to look at two different aspects, two conditions. Emotional attachment by memory. So all of us are going to have that. There's going to be something that sparks a memory, buildings that give us that emotional attachment, whether it's our childhood homes or whatever. And then the other one is more on the architect kind of side of things, and that's the emotional, reactional kind of response that we have to architecture. Now, I used to blog a lot, and I was invited by the folks down in Carroll County to do some work for them in putting together a kind of a little travel brochure. And I was out taking photographs for this brochure, and I got back it's one of those moments that just kind of hits you. And I got back to the house, and I wrote these words. So I don't know where you're at, if you're at home or in the office. If you have a window, stare out the window, just kind of imagine, some place back in your childhood, some place picturesque and scenic. Or if you're stuck in an office or a cubicle, just shut your eyes, Linda. She's making faces. Just shut your eyes and just imagine that space. And I'm going to talk about this location. It's actually they're on Wildcat Creek in Carroll County near the Adams Mill, if you've been there. So I'll just read this. This was my post. As I walked the narrow winding road from Adams Mill to the covered bridge over Wildcat Creek, the late afternoon sun dappled through the dense tree canopy overhead. It was a warmer than usual September day, and the sun's rays were quickly absorbed by my black t-shirt. With my camera to my side, I became acutely aware of my surroundings. At first, the silence in the vale seemed only broken by the few birds perched high in the canopy, and then by my own footsteps on the road surface. But then ultimately, it was my own breathing I heard until I reached the point where the ripples in Wildcat Creek drowned out all the other incidental noises I had become aware of. As I approached the old covered bridge, the smell of aged timbers wafted through the air. I walked slowly across the bridge to absorb both the history and scenic vistas offered through its portals. The floorboards, even under my light steps, creaked appropriately to inform me of my surroundings. I eased my way down the embankment to Wildcat Creek and began to walk its semi-sandy edge guarded by massive sycamore trees whose gnarled roots held back the soil in drifts washed over by the rise and fall of creek waters. I turned toward the bridge again, snapped a few shots, and then back up to the road. Again, my stride was quicker as I began to round the bend of the road, and the mill came back into view. And then almost instinctively, I slowed down again as I noticed those sycamore trees roadside whose large branches stretched out above me. Their ghost-like white arms and distinctive aroma halted me in my tracks. And I said aloud, though so perfectly alone, I'm never more at home in Indiana than when I can hear the gentle churning of a creek and be shaded beneath the great outstretched arms of a sycamore tree. And then like floodwaters against my very soul, I was overwhelmed by a rush of emotions that flooded my mind, some taking me back to my childhood. And I have to admit, becoming just a little misty-eyed to feel so blessed. I guess I should have advanced that slide at least once while I was reading. So that's one of those moments where if you as a child, can think of the old watering hole that maybe you swam in, or, the town park that you went and played ball in, those are the kind of emotional, instinctive memories that come back to us, as we go to a place that reminds us of those feelings or those sights and sounds. So I want to talk about buildings, though. And what are those buildings that left an imprint on you? It could be your church, or maybe it was an old gym, your childhood home, or maybe it was Grandpa's barn. I hear so many people talk about how they used to play in Grandpa's barn. So let's talk about churches. And the one thing I saw over and over again this year as people began to come back into services after having been unable to get together for several months during 2020 because of COVID, I have heard so many times how it felt so good to be back inside the church building. And I think about that, and it's because there's this emotional attachment that we have to these buildings. And part of it's because of the life events that we've had there. I mean, so many people, will have their weddings there. Maybe their children will be baptized in the church, or, at life's end, we have our funerals at the church. So these churches begin to embody this kind of emotional attachment. And not only just because of the emotions we have, but the church as it's built kind of inspires us. It helps us look up, because typically there's steep roofs and tall crosses. And I put this in, we started attending the Church of the Brethren here in town, and it was so interesting to come back into that church because my wife and I had been married there. And then on top of that, there's just something special about walking into a church and seeing purple, during the time of Holy Week. So those are those kind of attachments or emotions that we have when we walk into some place that's held so many of our life events. And then other people, we'll talk about, how it felt so good to be, in their old school or in their high school gym. And I think that, that's one of those places, again, that it's kind of embedded in our memory because, we grew up in it, and it was a special place for us every Friday or Saturday night. For me, I didn't have an old gym. I didn't go to an old school, and it was fairly new, and it was fairly a brief period. But I had attended Bethel College, and every Friday night and every Saturday night that there was a game, we would be in Goodman Gym. Now, interestingly, I have friends that played basketball for Bethel who played in the old gym and then turned around and played in the new gym. And they said, it's just not the same because you don't have that echo, the roar of the crowd, you don't have the same kind of sound and smells of a hardwood floor. So, you know, I think of being in Goodman Gym, and I think about the sound of sneakers squeaking on the floor and the bounce of a ball and how that would echo at the old gym. And it brings back memories, like I said, of graduation, because we would meet in the gym. We actually had our ceremony in the gym, and then we would all filter out into the lawn afterwards and say our goodbyes to all of our friends. And then the building that I was most associated with at Bethel was the campus center. And I don't know if you can see it, but that's me with a mullet and my buddy with a mullet standing there getting some event ready for the student union.
I'm seeing some laughing faces.
Okay,
in the crowd.
that's because of the mullet, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Mine was not nearly as long as Mark's there, who's standing on the down on the ground. Childhood home, you know, everybody can probably relate to this, and so I stuck this picture. My mom's shaking her head, but you know, this the modern American Gothic here. This is probably going to be what resonates with people the most. But I wanted to talk about, and not that I'm not particularly fond of the home that, you know, that my parents built when I was probably 5. But I want to talk about something that became a special place for us for generations of our family, and that was the old truck stop. And in the upper right-hand corner is my grandma with my uncle and my cousin. And then, you know, this is what the truck stop looked like in the 80s. And then here in the 70s, they were celebrating their 25-year anniversary of having it open. And it's my grandma with my aunts, and my mom is, yeah, the shortest one, of course, on the right. But this for us became home. And I think it's because there were so many family members and even family events that happened here at the truck stop. And then, you know, the final day, when it was, you know, when my parents closed the truck stop, it was like losing an old friend, because you knew that you just weren't going to get that back. And even though you'd want to take your kids there, which I did before it was torn down, and you can see everybody has their hand over their nose, because at this point it was pretty nasty. There's times where you can't go back to something that all you have are memories. And that was kind of both a special and sad moment for me to take my kids through the truck stop. But I don't know that they really recall it much, other than probably it smelled really bad because of mold. So there are times when you can't go back. And another thing that I hear a lot is, like I mentioned, is kids when they were younger, kids playing in their grandpa's barn. And that's just something that we as Hoosiers have kind of just, so many of us have grown up with. In fact, I was talking with some friends earlier this week about baling hay. And I don't know that you've earned your stripes as a Hoosier until you've thrown some bales of hay around, which I had the unfortunate pleasure of doing. But yeah, I put up the quintessential Hoosier barn here. It's got a basketball rim on the front. But I want to talk about not so much my grandpa's barn, but an ancestor's barn that is up northeast of Bremen. And if you were here for the Amish presentation, you would have seen these photos. It just so happened that Karen Redinger and I had made these plans to go up and talk to a gentleman that lived at my ancestor's farm, and I didn't know it until we actually got there. But what was important for me is they took me on a tour of both the house and the barn. And so in this situation, it was trying to absorb as much as you possibly can. And I don't know, is it possible to go back to a place that you've never been? And I kind of wonder if there weren't, you know, some of my ancestors' ghosts kind of hanging around that day, and wondered why I didn't have the appropriate beard and the right haircut and the right clothing, meaning that it was an Amish farm. But anyway, I want to talk just a little bit about places, because I think places can do the same thing that buildings can, because we kind of form an attachment, to our surroundings, our environment. And if you're from Plymouth, how many of you feel like, if you've gone away from Plymouth and have come back to Plymouth, how many of you feel like, oh, you've arrived now because you've crossed under the viaduct and you've come into the downtown? I mean, it's that gateway kind of feeling of passing through and into a community. I want to talk about a place that had become special to our family. So in 1998, I proposed to my wife on the footbridge here, on the LaPorte Street footbridge. And so, yeah, that's an engagement picture. No mullet there. And then at our 20-year anniversary of when I proposed to my wife, we took our kids back to the same footbridge. And you'll see the date there, that's 2018. Well, in 2018, if you remember, we almost lost the footbridge. And I went back and kind of looked for some records. The photo at the bottom was taken by Josh Walker with a drone. And you can see the footbridge is in the very low end of the photo there. I don't know if they're seeing me point to that. And then the Garner Street Bridge is off to the left, or excuse me, to the right. But I wrote these words as we were all trying to, struggle and deal with the flooding. And it's about how your community becomes that special place. So I put in the lower corner, you can see the bridge where I asked my wife, Christine, to marry me. And further up is where we made our first home downtown. And off to the side is where we brought our babies home from the hospital and where they learned to take their first steps. Many of you have been impacted even deeper by the flood. Watch for opportunities where you can help with the relief effort in the coming days and weeks. Remember those neighbors who have lost everything in their homes and businesses. We will get through this strong and united, because that's what was on display at the Sandbagging Hills. God's peace to you all. And there were people that lost those childhood homes, where they had formed their memories from the flood. So again, I think that aspect of having that long-seated, bedded memory attached to whether it's a building or a community is something that needs to be celebrated. So now I'm going to take a little slightly different approach. And the question would be, well, can you have an emotional reaction to a new building, to something that has no memory, but instead is, or you have no memories of, but instead is something that is more of that emotional kind of stirring? Well, of course you can. Architects bank on this, right? And during the 1960s and 1970s, there was a movement called Brutalism, and they intended it to be dominating and in your face and oppressive almost. So I want to talk about how new buildings can be used to convey or to stir an emotion. So we talked about churches earlier. Well, churches are probably the most logical kind of building to use as an example, because churches, just by their architecture, build in emotion. And the church in the lower left-hand corner was built 800 years in England before St. Thomas was built. But look how similar they are. The windows are similar, the towers are fairly similar, right down to the buttresses that are holding the sides of the building, called those buttresses, and even the little cross that is a finial at the gable end of the building. So it's one of the most common things that we do. It's why we still build churches that look like this today. In American history, there was this movement to try to do recall. And what I mean by that is we were trying to convey a message based on the type of architecture that we began building again. So for example, and I think I've presented on Greek architecture in the past. There was a period called Greek Revival or Greek Revival architecture. And what they were trying to convey when they were building buildings that looked like Greek temples was the sense of democracy. The country was newly established. They wanted an American identity to our architecture. So what did they do? They borrowed from the oldest democracy at the time. And so they used Greek architecture to kind of convey our democratic roots. But then by about the late 1800s and certainly into the early 1900s, and really a style that's popular to some degree today, they decided, well, they wanted to rebirth the American kind of idea, the American roots. So colonial architecture or colonial revival became an important type. And so what they're trying to do is now they're conveying, well, let's get back to our roots. And this kind of became popular after 1876, after the centennial. And then by the early 1900s, there was another style that they wanted to try and exhibit, and that was the classical revival. And the idea behind that, and this is why so many banks and monuments were built in the style and a lot of civic buildings, is they wanted to establish a permanence, a feeling of permanence. And so these two pictures on the left are not from Plymouth, but as many of you noticed, that is the old bank building, which is now City Hall. Was built in the neoclassical or in the classical revival style. So that's kind of looking at how we try to convey something, an image or emotion or a recall with architecture. Now I want to talk just a little bit about how you can do the same thing with symbolism. And when I went putting this presentation together and I went looking for some old documents that I had, I came back across this, and I think this was about 2002 or 3. There was a group that had wanted to, the Potawatomi had wanted to build a cultural center, a conference center, southwest of Plymouth. And so we did some very preliminary kind of work. And so this is what we had proposed for this conference center, and it is just filled with symbolism. So the idea here is that when you go in and you experience the building, that the symbols that are there help convey the message. And and I didn't include a slide of this, but there's an architect that I kind of tried to model things after when I was in college, and his name was Christopher Alexander. And he had 2 main books. One was called the Pattern Language, and the other one was called The Timeless Way of Building. And you didn't look at Christopher Alexander, you didn't look at his work per se to get inspiration, you looked at his writings. Because the idea was there are languages that are built into our architecture, just like I showed you with that church. And what kind of language are you using that helps to create a space for people? And so right out of the gate, my second day on the job after graduating from college, my boss handed me a file, and it was for a lake house down in Culver. And so I, being the, just recently college graduate that I was, started pouring through some of Christopher Alexander's writings, and then also sketching, my sketchbook, a number of ideas. And there was a house that the family had built, the grandfather had built, that had burnt down. And so this was to replace that. So what I did is I tried to use some subtle imagery and symbols to design the house. And if you look, so these sketches were done well before the house was built, by about 2 years. There's some things that are built in. So the overall shape kind of helped identify it, or helped give it a presence of the old family home, because this is called a Dutch colonial. That's a gambrel style roof that many people think of as barn roofs. So kind of reshape the house with that kind of idea in mind. And then the oval window that looks down into a great room was supposed to be kind of like the idea that the grandfather was kind of looking down on the family still, that allowed that eye to the heavens to come into the great room, the two-story space. And then the thing that personally I thought was clever was I wanted something to say that the house that was there was no longer there. So almost like a sense of loss. And so at each one corner has a garage on it, but at the other three corners, I actually carved out the corner and put that fieldstone foundation as kind of a sense of loss, that there was something missing, but it also gave really great lake views because now you had double windows in each corner. So that's how you can actually kind of build in with symbolism and emotion, even when you're not really truly aware of it. And a few years later, I was asked to design my father-in-law's office building. And if you don't know what JGL is, it's a kind of a seed genetics trading brokering company located here in Plymouth. And at that time, they had their corporate office on Pidco Drive. So how many people have driven past this building and said, there's something very barn-like about that? Well, it was very intentional. So I kind of reached to these agricultural roots to do the design work on the building. So not only does the shape start to convey that, but even in the way that the masonry interacts and the banding was supposed to project, what an old corn crib or granary would have that same feel. And even on the inside told the story of the life of a plant. So there was everything from the richness of the colors in the earth to how the plant would sprout, and then the green on the walls, and then it would resolve itself into harvest time. So there was actually like a harvest gold color that I used. So you can actually design into a building the story of what that building is there for, which is interesting. Not every architecture school teaches this, and I'm not going to pick on Notre Dame that they don't, but a few of my friends that went to school with me, really embraced this idea of symbolism. And if you go past the building, there's just a hint of a silo on the entry, so just watch for that. So I was trying to, just have some fun with it. It's a little whimsical, but definitely points to the agricultural. So just going to kind of close. So what's our challenge? So we have buildings that represent us now. So whether by symbolism or emotion, we have buildings that have come to symbolize who we are as a people. And I can't think of two better buildings in Plymouth than these two. So for Marshall County, it's the Marshall County Courthouse, which is now at its 150th year. Next year, it will mark its 150th year from its dedication. And if you follow the news, we did a tower restoration study or general restoration study, and they've taken bids. And we're going to be asking the county council to commit some more funding toward that project in order to do this. The courthouse hasn't had a substantial restoration on it for over 100 years. So it's time. And what I'd like to see, and what's part of the drawings, is the center louver in the tower used to be a window on all four sides. And in the drawings, it actually calls for that window to be put back so that at night it's lit from inside. But then in Plymouth, we have something that's really equally important and quite honestly unusual in Indiana, to have our original city hall and fire station. And this building has got to have some attention put on it. So I'm advocating, I'm lobbying. I'm sure the museum appreciates this, but this building has had architectural studies done on it as well. And my understanding is there's some possibility of doing a stellar project that would incorporate the fire station as some kind of business site, almost like a incubator site or shared office space. So the challenge is to find what is important to us as a community and then work to preserve that. And I'm often reminded of this passage that's in Isaiah. And I often also hear people talk about the old train depot, like, let's do something about that. So if you're of that mindset, you know, I would point to this verse, Isaiah 58:12. You'll use the old rubble of past lives to build anew, rebuild the foundations from out of your past. You'll be known as those who can fix anything, restore old ruins, rebuild and renovate, make the community livable again. And I think that that's kind of what it boils down to in terms of what makes our community, well, what makes a community livable. And oftentimes it's those landmarks that we take with us that kind of stir that emotion and stir that sense of belonging. So that's it. Sarah said there might be questions, so I'm happy to field questions. This will be an interesting way to do this.
Yeah, it will be.
Have you tried this before?
Not in this exact setup, but yeah, if anyone has a question, go ahead and use the chat box, or you can unmute yourself and we'll all hear you. I'm not seeing any questions.
No questions.
You were just so thorough.
That must be it, or people
Yeah.
don't know how to use that chat box. Or,
Yeah, yeah.
Well, yeah, I certainly appreciate Sarah setting this up, and you know, people know how to reach out to me if they're interested in what I talked about or anything. Yes, certainly feel free to reach out to me. But
Oh, we're getting some comments.
Okay,
They say,
all right.
great program, good presentation. All compliments.
I can't wait to see everybody in person again. So thanks for joining us. Certainly.
Yeah, it was so great to see everyone. Yeah, please come in, stop in and see us. We're open, and we've missed everyone over these past few months, and we can't wait to do Brown Bags in person once again. Oh, Nancy says, like the symbolism woven in.
Thanks.
Yeah, lots of comments. All right, guys, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
We hope to see you soon. Bye.
Thank you.